Thank you to everyone here today for attending this town hall. It's the second event that has ever been thrown by the newly reactivated College Democrats at Weber State University. I'm the president of this organization, Ethan Bishop. Right over here is Alex, which is our vice president. And I want to start by thanking the candidates for being here. Representative Rosemary Lesser, running for re-election to Utah House District 10. Ogden City Councilwoman Angela Choberka, running for Utah House District 9. And Ogden School Board member Stacy Bernal, running for Utah Senate District 3. So how this is going to work today is we're going to ask a couple of questions before leaving the floor open to anyone who would like to ask the candidates anything. So, just raise your hand if you want to be selected. Like this, you can probably just kind of blurt it out if there's once we get to it. So yeah, and then we'll jump back in, then we'll kind of go back and forth. So I want to start off by asking a question to all three of you. There are only 23 days left, counting today, before Election Day. What do y'all think about your chances of winning your races now that we're in the home stretch? And what are the key strategies you'll be focusing on to push your campaigns over the finish line? Let's start with Representative Lesser.
Great. Well, thank you very much. As you can see, I'm wearing my shirt, and I just came back from going door to door and talking with people. And that is one of our most vital strategies, is just the exchange of ideas, working hard. And I have an advantage as an incumbent because I can knock on the door and say, I am your representative, and I am committed to doing that, being a representative, and that's why I'm at your doorstep. Tell me about some of the things that are most important to you. And quite honestly, I acknowledge that many people don't have any idea who the representative is. I usually kid about that. I'd say, I didn't know who my representative was either. Nobody likes to be, scolded. And so, just establishing a rapport. In these closing days, certainly, the thing about canvassing is that it's a pretty time-intensive process for relatively small amount of space that you can do. And so organizations like this, where we can get our message out to a number of people, is really, really important, because for each person who believes in us, they tell another person and another person, and your opinion matters, and you are our best advocates. And so I am glad you're here. And for those of you who I don't know, I'm presumptuous to assume you're advocates, but if I win your support, I would love to have you in these closing days share that message with others.
Well, thank you so much for the question. So I'm Angela Choberka, and I'm running for House District 9, as was mentioned. And I think, along with what Rosemary is saying, one thing that my campaign has really been focused on, as I know most of ours have, and I even did this in my council race as well, is I'm a data person. So I like to know the data and the information. So I know that there's going to be because it's a presidential election, it's going to be a high voter turnout in my district. So I have about 18,000 votes that are available to me. Unless, it goes a little bit higher or lower based on maybe some of these ballot initiatives, or some of these other things that are going on in the bigger political sphere as well. So my win number is just over 9,000, because that's what I want to do. So what we do on the campaign trail is we designate a certain amount of houses we want to knock, which can be challenging, as you'll hear. Stacy's district is quite large. So depending on what it is, the house districts are comparable, but mine is a downtown part of Ogden, where I currently represent, a part of Roy, and then a huge part of West Haven. So it's a lot of territory, really, to cover. So you really have to think about that and focus on who you want to go and knock on their door, who you're going to call, who you're going to send mailers to, and then also thinking about a digital strategy, because we know a lot of people get information from social media or other kinds of digital means, emailing, texting, all of those things too. So we really try to be strategic about that. We have limited resources. Obviously, it's a shame that we have to raise a lot of money to do these types of campaigns, But that's actually what we use the money for. And sometimes people don't understand it. Like, why do they keep asking me for more money? Why do they need to raise X amount of dollars? Well, it's because for myself, I have a full-time job. I'm a council member still. I'm a mom of a family. And I also want to do a really good job at this campaign, so I have to hire staff to help me. I also need to pay for all these other needs too. So in this last couple of weeks, we'll still be knocking doors. I should say that the audience that I'm trying to attract is that persuasion universe. So I know most of the people that are Democrats already that always vote, I'll probably get their vote unless something weird is happening. But that persuasion universe is people that I want to talk to say, this is why you should choose me when you are choosing from all sides. And then I also will try to actually attempt to reach out by canvassing to some people that are not likely voters, but maybe, so I'm really going to try to do that too.
So my situation is very similar because we actually all three have the same campaign team that we have hired and are paying to help us with our campaigns. And I made that choice in part because I had seen what they did for Representative Lesser's prior race, and I said, if you want to win, then you hire the people that help you win. So that's why I went with that team. But I cannot believe we're 3 weeks away because we have been working so hard for so long, and it feels kind of surreal that we're so close to the finish line. And I'm a marathoner, I'm a runner, and so I don't know, are any of you runners here? Like, my last marathon that I ran was in 2017. It was the Big Cottonwood Marathon. And if you've ever done that race, it's very downhill at the start, but then it flattens out a lot at the end. And you have to do a lot of miles that you don't have that momentum of gravity. And when I did it, I was at mile 22 and I felt like I was dying. It was like I was so sick and it was getting so hot, and I called my husband and I said, I can't do it. I'm gonna just lie down on the side of the road and you can come pick up my body. And he's like, you're only 4 miles away. You're only 4 miles away. And I said, it might as well be another marathon. So anyway, I finally finished. And but anyway, that's what I correlate this experience to right now is I'm at the point where I'm gonna lie down on the side of the road and just be done. But it's also really exciting because the work that has gone on behind the scenes. I think people, once they start seeing signs and once they see, once they're really kind of tapping into paying attention, like, oh, ballots are coming out, like, I guess I should start thinking about this thing. And we have been thinking about it nonstop the entire year. And it's just really exciting that, I don't know, it's like almost like having a baby or something. But my strategy is very similar to what they have been doing. My opponent, when I announced my candidacy last year, he is a multimillionaire, so he put $100,000 of his own money into his campaign account, and it took me 10 months to raise that, but now I have outraised him, and it is, it's because I have to pay all that money to get my digital advertising out there, to pay for postcards and mailers and everything else that I've had to do. So the district goes from about 23rd in Ogden up to North Ogden, and then part of Pleasant View, and then it wraps over to the valley, and I have Eden, Liberty, and Huntsville, not Mountain Green, and then part of Morgan, and then some of these very rural areas, so Hennifer and Colville and Longship, and then 7,000 addresses in Summit County. So it is a huge, huge district, and my win number is over 27,000, and when I see those numbers, yes, the data is good to know, but it is also it's very overwhelming. So I see the numbers and I know the numbers, but then there's also this part of me that's like, yeah, but I put it on my vision board. And so that's also part of the strategy. I'm going to manifest it, but no, truly, like the work, the level of work that has gone into this, and it has been a huge collaborative team effort. So.
Another thing that is likely on all of our minds here in this room is the cost of living. But firstly, I want to zero in on things like groceries. Many people see the prices on the shelves and they automatically jump to blaming, Biden or Harris. But recent polling shows a large proportion of Americans are not simplistically blaming the president, they're blaming large businesses for what is called price gouging, which is huge corporations who had to raise prices due to disruptions caused by the pandemic. They have kept prices the same even after the American economy has recovered. And many retailers like Walmart are only now starting to lower prices. So my question to all three of you is, how will you fight price gouging and lower grocery prices if you are elected to the Utah State Legislature? So let's start with Angela Choberka.
Oh, well, thanks. I'm trying to think of my answer. Well, I think you're right that it is very complex. Sometimes people like to try to blame, maybe local public servants or they think about the president. But I agree that it's much more complex than that, and that it is a shame that sometimes corporations are only out for the buck. That's a challenge. At the state level, I would say I totally support, I don't want to steal what Representative Lester's going to say, but I support her effort to eliminate the food tax. I think that would be a really huge benefit to our communities, what we could do something locally. At the state level, I'm not sure there's much we can do about corporations, but maybe she can illuminate that if that's a possibility. I also think for me, I'm really focused on thinking about how we can increase the wages for our people up here in Weber County. I know that there's quite a disparity from wages in Salt Lake County versus Weber County, and that would really help our residents so they could stay working close to home versus having to do a commute maybe to Salt Lake, or like for me, I work from home, but it's for a company that's based in Salt Lake. So I think that's really important to me, is build a community where people can work closer to home, make a livable wage, and then hopefully we can also work the other way to help eliminate some of those terrible things that people are doing.
I actually, last week here, there was the Unity Conference. So I don't know if anyone saw that or attended any of that. In prior years, for 25 years, it was called the Diversity Conference, but we're apparently no longer allowed to say that. Sorry to any of those listening ears out there.
You're allowed to say
They're gonna call some hotline because I said the dirty D word. Anyway. So the Unity Conference, the theme this year was breaking bread, breaking barriers, or maybe I'm flipping it, but it was talking about food justice, food injustice, and talking about these concepts of food deserts and accessibility to healthy, nutritious food, and how we know there's these staggering socioeconomic barriers for people to be able to access fresh and healthy food and affordable food. We definitely have those issues here in Ogden, and we were talking about it on the city council level, that with not even having grocery stores in a lot of these communities, and that's a huge disservice to our residents. But even I think beyond that, one of the presentations I went to, it was Ann Dunaway's, and she was talking about the companies that own all of these food companies. So we think when we are going to the grocery store that we're looking at the Kroger brand, the Kraft brand, the Hershey, all of these different brands. But truly, it's like 5 global companies that own all the subsidiaries and all of the smaller brands around the world. And I think that's terrifying, and that is way too much power. So as a legislator, how do we even begin to tackle that when you're talking on a global scale? These are, it's I guess that's why I was called a Marxist, because I care very much about how we can take care of the average, everyday person fighting against this huge, the billionaires, the gazillionaires of the world. And that's really, that is an issue with our food. So anything that I can do as a state senator to address that, I certainly will, but understanding that it is a huge, huge problem to tackle.
Well, this topic is something that I've been obsessed with ever since I entered the legislature. And as my colleagues know, I introduced a bill to eliminate the food tax back in 2022, at a time when food inflation, prices were soaring, availability, and I thought this is the one thing that the state can do for the benefit of everyone. More than 41 states in our country do not tax food. This has been something that has been a bipartisan issue. Governor Huntsman continued the work of Governor Matheson, a Democrat. This has been something we've been working at for a long, long time. And I thought that if nothing else, during the time of COVID, when prices were soaring, that I would be able to get some traction with removing the food tax. I was voted down. It was a bipartisan effort. I stood right next to Phil Wyman, who also was advocating right next to me for eliminating the tax on food. Now that's one of the things that I wanted to emphasize. As Democrats, we work to build consensus. If you can have the only Democrat elected outside of Salt Lake County be in line with Phil Lyman, that means that you're doing some major league bridge building. And so, to your original question, we need to eliminate the tax on food. Now, one of the confounding issues that arose is that the leadership knew that my idea was a good idea. So what the compromise was, and I wasn't so crazy about this at all, and fought to separate it, was to have the removal of the food tax be on your ballot. However, since the legislative leadership recognized that this was really a good idea, they appended it to being able to gut the education fund and use income tax revenue for anything that they wanted. And so I fought on the floor and said, look, these two things don't have anything to do with each other. Removing the tax on food and you wanting to open the bank to anybody who has anything. I was voted down on that. But what happened is it was going to go on the ballot. I thought it would be great for people to have the opportunity to vote. However, I hated the poison pill that went with it, which was gutting public education. As many of you may know, the courts ruled that the legislature was not paying attention to the rules and did not publish an amendment in the newspapers as they were supposed to. And so neither of the constitutional amendments will be considered this time. But even having said that, at the end of the day, removing the sales tax on food does not belong in the Utah Constitution. I mean, what were we thinking? It can be accomplished by legislation, and if people are actually doing the right thing for the people of Utah, it could be on the governor's desk by the end of January if people have the political will.
All right, so now I'm going to pass the mic over to Alex to ask a few questions.
Suck it up.
Thank you, Alex.
Alright, okay, so this first question is for Rosemary Lesser. You sponsored legislation to expand access to Medicaid for new mothers, but expanding social programs, even incredibly popular ones, is not always popular with Republican politicians. And in the legislative body with a supermajority of said politicians, what is your strategy going forward to expand access to healthcare in the face of fierce opposition? And on a more personal level, how does it feel being a member in the minority party trying to push against the Republicans for things like expanding Medicaid?
Thank you very much. That's a great question, and the question itself reveals remarkable insight on the dynamics of the legislature. So thank you for that. Indeed, I did really work hard to extend the care for a woman after delivery, person after delivery, at Medicaid until just this past year, cut off all resources 60 days after delivery. Now, many of you may know my origin story. I'm an obstetrician gynecologist, so I can speak with immense authority about this, and shared with my colleagues about the reality that 60 days after delivery still has so many health issues that are left unaddressed. So I presented it in what's called our interim committee hearings, and got people at least talking about it. One of the strategies when you are in the minority is try to get subject matter experts to come testify in your behalf. And so I brought in obstetrician gynecologist from the University of Utah Medical School who spoke about the actual presence of death from substance abuse disorders and the sequelae of postpartum depression and how we needed to do better. So the way this finally came about is there was a person who heard the story that I told, a person in the Senate, and he came up to me afterwards and he said, "Rosemary, that was a great presentation. It really touched my heart because I had someone who had postpartum depression and I would like to be the Senate sponsor for your bill." And I thought, that's wonderful. We always have to have both a House and Senate sponsor. I said, great, be my Senate sponsor, I welcome it. Well, actually what happened was he just took the bill and took it away and introduced it from the Senate and actually named a different House sponsor for that bill. But here's the thing. Were my feelings a little roughened by that experience? Yeah, I had done a lot of work to gather this up. But what really matters at the end of the day is that people get health care after postpartum. And for me, that is paramount. And so you just have to get over ego and instead of saying, it was my idea, I said, you know, my goal is the benefit of people here in the state of Utah receiving the care they need, no matter how they got it. So it's an exercise in humility.
So with essentially the same question for Choberka and Stacy Bernal. If you are elected, how do you plan to navigate a state house basically infested with Republican supermajority to get things done for your constituents?
Good verb choice.
And I like to say when we're elected, so just give it. But yeah, I think it's kind of similar. You know, obviously we have a wonderful mentor in Rosemary already being there and knowing what a great influence even the minority voices can have at the Capitol. But also we're working toward building a bench so that we can eliminate the supermajority. That's our ultimate goal, right? Is to have more balance in that house, because right now it feels a little bit, especially with this behavior over these amendments this past couple of months, it really feels like they will do whatever they would like because they have so much power, and that supermajority really makes that happen. But I would say, in my experience working on council, it's similar. We don't usually know each other's parties. Some people might have even been surprised. I doubt they were surprised when I filed as a Democrat. But I've worked across the aisle to do things that are right for the community, and I think, just to Rosemary's point, you find shared values with people you don't realize you're going to have shared values with if you get to know them and build a relationship. I also think that my colleagues, we definitely respect each other just as people, so we know each other in that way, but also they know there's certain things that I'm not going to budge my stance on, and the other things I'm willing to give and take, and they're similar. I think they have similar perspectives, so I think that's important. But I also think, to Rosemary's point, it is important to realize that there's so much work you do behind the scenes sometimes that the public may not see, but you're able to influence making things better or making them not as bad as they were going to be before. And I think that's really important, and also it's so important for us just to model for other people so that they would take up the reins later too.
So there is a reason that my campaign color is purple. A, I love purple. B, I'm a proud Weber State alum. See, it was also my school board color, and so I just, already had lots of purple. But finally, that combination of red and blue. And the fact is, even when we win, and we also have some great other Democratic candidates on the ballot in Salt Lake and further south, and some great independent candidates as well. So even when they win, and we can start breaking down that supermajority, we still have to work together. We have to play nice in the sandbox. As much as sometimes we might not have those warm, fuzzy feelings toward other people, we have to be able to work together. And the bottom line always has to be what is best for the people of Utah. And sometimes, to Rosemary's point, you are a stronger person than I am to say, I could have been like, that was my idea, because that's very hard to take our egos out of it. Like, that is a fantastic idea, and you should have rightfully gotten the credit for that. But sometimes that's not how things are going to happen. We just have to be able to set aside our personal feelings about it and say at the end of the day, like, I wouldn't be able to go to sleep at night knowing that I did everything I could to advocate for what was in the best interest. And I think that's why this election will be so interesting. I feel like we're in this time of social experiment to see what's going to happen, because we have been dominated by Republicans for so long, and I think that has led to this feeling of the elected leaders feeling that they don't need to be held accountable because they're among their people, right? And I think enough Republican registered voters are kind of sick of that yeah, we might be from the same party, but you are not acting in my family's best interest. And so I think that I talk to people all the time that say to me, I have never voted for a Democrat. You will be the first Democrat I ever vote for. And I think also that's partly that's how I win. And I am also endorsed by some Republicans. And I think, it's funny, as parties, we want to have this like, your team, my team, like this is how. Again, we have to be able to come together, and it will help me to be endorsed by Republicans. And I'm sure that there are some Democrats who think that that's like me selling out, or why am I had someone question, like, why are you not leading out with the fact that you're a Democrat? Because unfortunately, where you can put an elephant on your sign and that's an advantage, if I do that, it's a disadvantage. And we did polling in my district, and we saw that just based on name and party affiliation, obviously my opponent had an advantage. But when people were able to get past just the political affiliation and they read our bios and our messaging, we came out dead even. So that means people are willing to change their vote based on what I'm running for. So I think I meandered a little bit off of the original question, but yeah, we need to start with breaking up that supermajority and then working together and bringing some rationality and sanity to the legislature.
With that, does anyone have any questions?
I do. I am one of those commuters. I commute to Salt Lake. I commute back. I have very impassioned views about the difficulties we face as a nation. I've just moved back to Utah after living in Washington for a couple of years. Don't know that my life was a lot better there based on what they offer. But oh no, that's it. So I lived there for only a couple of years, but it seemed like there were a lot more opportunities and a lot more support for people than I'm seeing here. And I work like a dog, right? My question really is, how do we, when we see how difficult things are and what we're up against, make a difference in our own community as an average person who has very minimal personal time, right? Because I'm busy with work and trying to support myself and my family. How do we make an impact? Obviously voting helps, right? Buying a sign, sure, but in what other ways can we, when we're so limited on time and we're so stressed all the time, how do we make an impact and make a change?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for being here. And that's a great question. People have so many things going on in their life, and yet there are things that are important in this political space. I think that finding some, if whatever area you're most passionate about, there are advocacy groups of people who feel passionate about this too. Like for instance, we have the Citizens Climate Lobby. And so we have a group dedicated to saving the Great Salt Lake. We have our groups involved with LGBTQ rights, women's rights, and even in Utah, these organizations are robust. And so my advice is, and you know, with your favorite search engine, I am positive that you can find a group that is even in this local area that would be rewarding, provide personal connections, and also get things done. The Citizens Climate Lobby is just remarkable. They go in and they're taught how to talk with people who don't even believe that climate change is real, and yet they get those skills. So check out some of these advocacy groups. They're great. I'd be happy to offline help you with some of that.
I would just say, A, I applaud you for coming tonight when you could be doing a million other things. And I would say, don't be too hard on yourself if you're not in a place where you can do as much as you would like to do. Because we just have seasons, right? Like there's just sometimes, and it might not be now, your circumstances might change in a year or two, and then maybe that's when you say, I'm gonna run for city council, or I'm gonna do whatever thing it is that you're passionate about. But when I think back over the last 15 years of my life, I was a single mom when I came back to school here at Weber State. My son was getting his autism diagnosis. I was barely getting by. It took everything in me to find a parking spot and get my butt into class every day and get my child situated. And like I look back at that and think, how did I even get through that time? And there was no way I could have done any more than what I was doing. And once I got to, once I finally graduated, and then once I got to a place where I started having a little bit more of a financial security, and then I could start volunteering, and then I could, and that was kind of very incrementally my story of getting civically engaged, getting involved in the community. But it wasn't, when I was a single mom trying to put myself through school, that wasn't the time. And now I'm unemployed. Also, not necessarily the route I would recommend, but I was working with Utah Jazz for the last year and a half, and left a really cool job to focus on this race, because that's how important it is to me. But anyway, I just share all that to say the fact that you're here means something, and this could be the seed that is planted that maybe later, it will open up more opportunities. But
You could be on this podium.
yeah. So just, do what you can, where you can, and with whatever you have. And there are a ton of nonprofits in this community that will happily take any amount of time that you can commit. So, thanks.
I love that. And the only other thing I would add is my political career. Well, I realized later that it actually started in high school. I was on my student council senior year, because I'm old enough that you could actually smoke outside the back of the building. And at that year, a friend of mine ran. It was kind of a joke a little bit, but we got all those people to go in and vote, and I was elected to the senior student council. So I've always been working to engage unusual voices. Because they didn't have representation. And I was a smoker at that time, so it was very cool. But I'm not any longer. But anyway, I would say, it must have been about 10 years ago, my friend Arlene Anderson, who's now on the school board as well, we went to an event called Real Women Run, and now it's Utah Women Run. And at that event, basically there was some seasoned people that had served in the legislature and other leadership roles. And they basically just talked about, and I totally agree with Stacy, there's a time and place for everything, but they basically said if you don't see yourself in those spaces or your representation there, then it might be you that needs to do it. And because I'm really a person, honestly, that I work behind the scenes, I like to be part of the project, but not the person leading out. So I'm super uncomfortable with being recorded, being on video, doing this kind of stuff in public is not my comfort zone. And so I think that's just an important note that you all are already qualified to do these things. Because once you start listening more closely to some of the people that are in these positions, you will be like, I know more than that person, and I actually could do that. And I'm totally dead serious. You'll be like, oh my goodness. Yeah, so you're totally qualified and you can do this if you wanted to. But I always tell people when they're thinking about running, because that's something I think all of us are really invested in, is mentoring and bringing up people to feel that they could run if they'd like to, is there's actually different places for everyone. I have friends that are very, very activist oriented, that are very passionate about particular topics. And I've often talked to them and said it's actually very difficult to be an activist and serve, because you do have to compromise sometimes. And sometimes people don't like it when you have to compromise to many points that were made. And we need activist voices to push the conversation in other directions. So that's what I always try to kind of point out there, is that everybody has the place or the role to play in politics as well. So I was gonna say right now, actually, a great example is my brother-in-law at the University of Michigan. He actually at work, speaking to your point of like being like bogged down at work, he worked with people to unionize their staff. And that was what he did for his passion. So I think there's other ways to do service and to broaden the conversation and to help people be engaged, besides necessarily running for these types of seats. But you're totally capable of doing that too.
You were all very inspiring.
Any other questions?
So, I don't go to Weber State, but I do go to Utah State, and one thing I hear all the time from people on campus is, they're like, oh, I don't know about voting because I don't think I'm going to be heard, I don't really think my voice matters. So I guess my question for each of you is, how would you address the concerns of the younger generation as they are becoming such an important demographic, especially for the left?
That is a great concern for voters, especially when you live in states where during a presidential election, with our electoral vote, in a presidential election, unfortunately, we're not going to have, our vote isn't necessarily going to matter as much. However, in local state races, that's where it makes the biggest difference. And so from the state legislature to city councils to school boards. And so that's what I always tell people, even if you don't feel like it's going to make a big difference nationally, it does make a difference in your state and in your hometown. And don't waste that voice. Don't waste that voice, because we have some races in our state that it could be it could be 3 votes that makes the difference of a person when you're losing their race. And we had, Priscilla Martinez, when she ran, 78 votes that she lost a city council seat. And was she even the first Latina? I don't remember.
Perhaps, I'm thinking, Garcia was there, but they did not, maybe.
Anyway, all that to say, it really does make a difference on a local level. So I just tell people, that's your voice, that's your power, and if you have that ability in this country, why would you not use it? So.
just gonna say, yeah, I was gonna say the same thing, and I also think, I think that people are making a statement when they choose not to vote. Some people obviously, like, they're just beyond their control that it's not gonna work out for them, they're gonna vote. But when people actively choose not to vote, they actually are voting, right? Because they're not putting their vote in a place that's going to count. So they're taking it away in a way too. Like we were saying, I mean, I don't know what the population in Utah is, 3.5 million. 3.5 million. Or my district for council, I think is probably, it's pretty, you know, the council districts are a little bit smaller. So I would say, let's make it, let's say it's 20,000 people. I won my race with 788 votes. So we're not voting at the same rate of the population. So I feel like it is challenging because a lot of times people would say, Utah must be it's just super red, it's very Republican. But we were having a conversation last night around this gerrymandering issue, right? Our state has been cut up in ways on purpose to allow certain parties to have an advantage. And if we are able to get the redistricting done, I think that would have changed, especially for a place like Ogden that's been cut up into so many little pieces. Perhaps we would have a little bit more of a voice if we had representation that was more concentrated. So.
And a lot of these races are Republicans running unopposed.
Yep.
So that leads to, again, you know, having more of that representation. And I mean, our voter registration for the state is 52.2% Republican active registered voters. That's not a huge majority, and often residents register as Republicans so they can vote in the primary. So I feel like we are more purple. In my heart, we're more blue, but we're definitely more purple than we look on paper. So,
but they always vote.
yes.
They always vote.
And Stacy's absolutely right. When you look at what's happening in Utah, there are almost as many independents in the district that I represent as there are Republicans. And when you look at the characteristic of those, well, first of all, why are they independents in the first place? I mean, that means they stepped away for the most part from the Republican Party to be an independent. And you know what? That, in my mind, takes a lot of courage because there are so many cultural things that go along with being a Republican that people say, I'm a Republican, and as if, you know, that's describing the color of their eyes. And more and more people are just saying, I would like to think for myself, and I think for every single one of us, we say, hooray. Think for yourselves. Vote for somebody who has your interest at heart. Vote for somebody who also is going to stand up for the person who doesn't have the voice. Stacy can share a little bit about some of the work she's done, but I can tell you, when I cast the no vote over and over again, when I cast the no vote against this DEI bill, when I cast the no vote against the bathroom bill, when I cast the no vote about people making their own decisions about their bodies for the reproductive health care, I was outvoted, but I was the vote that stood for all of you. And I am proud of those votes. I got to the point where I'd actually take pictures of them for those no votes. And they are so important. And one other thing I wanted to share with you and tell you why this is so important, and hopefully why the gerrymandering will be, there'll be some balance with creation of new districts. But right now, there are, remember we talked about 3.5 million people in Utah. There's about 1.5 million who live in Salt Lake County. I am the only Democrat elected outside of Salt Lake County. That's 2 million people. Now, does anybody think that that's rational representation? That's an open question. No is the answer. And with people voting down ballot, we can make a change in that, and we can have more equal representation. Stacy, you should share about your op-ed on groupthink. I think that was fabulous. Go for it.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, so it was a couple weeks ago in the Standard Examiner, I just wrote an op-ed about how, well, does anyone remember the Challenger space shuttle blowing up? I know, like, there's, okay, some of you are too young to like, what? Challenger? So that happened on my 9th birthday. And I just, that moment is, one of those core memories where this horrible tragedy happened and ruined my birthday. No, that's not the point. But learning about it afterwards and kind of why did this space shuttle malfunction? What happened, that 73 seconds after it took off that it then blew up? And it was a tiny device called an O-ring, this little rubber O-ring, that malfunctioned because it was unseasonably cold that day in Florida. And there were scientists who knew that that was a possibility, who knew, like, this could be bad. But no one, and actually I believe that there were a couple scientists who did speak up, but they were not listened to. So that has ultimately led to losing 7 astronauts. And so.
And a teacher.
Oh yeah. So.
Sorry.
Thank you, no thank you. Now I should go, you're gonna go fact check my article. Like, she was wrong. But it's the whole point of how harmful groupthink can be. And so to have an 81% Republican supermajority making policy for a demographics of 50% Republicans, and it's a 75% male body. Also making decisions for about a population that's about 50% women. Not to even touch on other demographics of that group, but it is not a reflective body of what our state looks like. And they are in their circle of groupthink. We can do what we want. No one's going to call us out. No one's going to say that's a bad idea. We're just going to push these bills through. And what are the really bad outcomes going to be of these bills? And very specifically in the last session, and very personally to me, was it ended up being rewritten as the Equal Opportunity Initiative, but it explicitly takes out diversity, equity, and inclusion from higher education K through 12 and government. And I was the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Manager at the Utah Jazz. I was the first and will be the last, because they actually changed my title in March to Inclusion and Belonging because of what was happening with the political climate. And now that I'm gone, which I chose to leave, I don't think they'll backfill it. And really, I was leaving when the priorities were getting hockey to come in, and I felt like my work was becoming more controversial and less prioritized. And truly, I thought, whatever we call it, however we want to label it, the work still remains. And if I can't do it at this highly influential organization in the state, then I want to do it at the legislature. And, it is tackling, when we were first talking about my campaign, we had a conversation about, do we even say diversity, equity, and inclusion? Like, maybe let's not even say it. It's impossible to not address it. And a huge thing for me is we have to reframe what that means. Because I have a 19-year-old autistic son. And in 2018, I founded an annual event called Awesome Autistic Ogden, because I know that his life outcomes are not great. And certainly when I'm gone, that he's going to slip through the cracks. So I'm doing everything in my power to help create a better place for him and people like him. So I've been serving on this Autism After 21 statewide initiative for 3 years. And one of the calls to action that we found after 3 years of research was that we need businesses, organizations to focus on DEI efforts, specifically for people with disabilities and neurodiversity. So to see it unraveling, to see how it's impacting people like my son, not to mention our LGBTQ loved ones, the Women's Center closing here at Weber State. It has been incredibly hurtful to watch all of that happening and to know all of the people who are going to be negatively impacted by that. And that was a direct result of a crappy bill.
So, yeah, there's already a lot of talk about the DEI, but I kind of wanted to flesh that out a little bit. So Angela Choberka, I think you had the background being an educator. As Stacy said, she served on the, or she is a current member of the Ogden School Board, served on the Weber State's board and that kind of thing. So I just want to ask, I guess all three of you, what kind of, do you think about the DEI bill? What do you think about the prospects of how we can mediate this and maybe even pass a bill to reinstate it? And yeah, just if you have any other thoughts on that before we move on.
That's okay. So in my day job, I was an educator in my past, and in my day job I work on equity initiatives for Select Health, which is part of Intermountain Healthcare. So one reason that I ended up working in healthcare, even though I was a teacher before, was when I was teaching, I really felt this struggle where I had students and families that it didn't seem like they had the same opportunities as everybody else, that there was some disparities there. So I started working, actually, I went back to school, did a lot of research in this area on how we build our neighborhoods, and I worked on a Promised Neighborhood initiative right here in Ogden called the Promised Neighborhood Initiative. And it was focused on thinking about education outcomes, looking at those, and then you disaggregate them to see how everybody's doing, whether it's based on gender, age, race, ethnicity, language spoken, and we could see some very large disparities in our community here in Ogden, but it actually happens all across the nation, right? That based on where a person lives, a lot of times just those, the way the community is built impacts how well they do in school, and then that later impacts how they do in life, honestly. And it's not just the data that's the most important part, it's realizing that there's families and students that are behind that data. So I started working in Intermountain on a project that was looking at the social determinants of health, which also feeds into that. So it's about the place where a person lives, works, and plays, and really thinks about those basic necessities like food and shelter, transportation, utilities. If you don't have kind of those basic necessities met, it's very hard then to focus on your schoolwork. That makes sense, right? But it's also detrimental to your health, right? And so in this project, we looked at communities all across the state, and there's many that have similar statistics, but right here in Ogden and Weber County, there's a 10-year difference in life expectancy, can be up to 10 years based on where you live, whether it's on one side of Harrison Boulevard or the other. And we see that in Park City, which you might be surprised, right? Or in St. George. In other parts of the country, it can be up to 25 or 35 years difference based on where you live, just based on these factors. And obviously it has so much to do with systemic, historical things that have gone down, whether it's redlining or certain people of backgrounds or colors that aren't able to purchase homes and build wealth, right? So there's a lot of complex issues behind that. So when I think about eliminating programs that change the way these systems work, these organizations and institutions work to better serve all people, that is a really big problem because we know that there's disparities, and not we personally, but we as society have created them, and so we need to find ways to address them. And I feel very strongly that the research shows that programs that enable people to have the same opportunities are vital so that everyone can be successful. And I think it's a moral outrage if we don't address them. So I'm pretty passionate about it.
Awesome.
I could go on and on and on about this topic, and my poor colleagues who hear me speak about it all the time. Except for Toberka. The DEI, okay, let me back up. During COVID, during 2020, during the murder of George Floyd, we saw that there was this racial reckoning. And that didn't just happen in our country, this was global. I was speaking to people in other parts of the world that were saying, like, we also are seeing what's happening in your country. We all are talking about George Floyd. And being a part of that phenomenon and kind of seeing what was happening on top of just, the social isolation and the fear and everything, it was a very contentious time. In November of 2020, the there was a proclamation that was signed onto on the steps of the state capitol. And it was the Utah Racial Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Compact, acknowledging that there are issues of racism, discrimination happening in Utah, and that collectively, these leaders of the state were coming together to say, we are signing on to this document and committing to working on this and improving our state. And it was signed on by, at the time, Governor Herbert, incoming Governor Cox, hundreds, maybe thousands of community leaders. I know that Councilmember Choberka was on there, Rosemary's probably signed on to it, I'm signed on to it. And less than 4 years later, the pendulum has swung so far back in the opposite direction that this year in the legislative session, our governor called DEI evil. And it's not just Utah. This has been a national movement that has been happening. It's been, Florida, Oklahoma, Texas, all of these other states. It's been happening. And so I knew it was going to be happening here. But to see the impacts now, the fact that the diversity conference that had been at Weber State for 25 years, last year I had the privilege of moderating the conversation. The keynote presentation was Tim Howard, who is a world-renowned soccer player with Tourette syndrome. And they brought him into this very room, and it was the whole ballroom full of people. And this year, it was this size. And that was a direct impact of taking DEI out of, I think people are scared now. We're in this culture of our educators are afraid of what they can and can't say. And the fact that part of the bill says this is to promote educational and academic freedom and freedom of speech, and yet we have a hotline now, a hotline where people can call and report if they're feeling that they're using this terminology. That is not freedom. That is not freedom of speech. So when I win, people have asked, like, how are you gonna fix this? It's going to be really hard to ravel that back in. But I think, and I hope, I know that there is research being done here by a professor and by some students on what the impacts are now that the centers are closing. But we already had research that showed that they were beneficial. Having these places and spaces on our campuses were beneficial. So we already know that it's not good for students. And I think when we can start getting more data that shows how this is hurting graduation rates or enrollment or whatever, because I think if we can tie it to money, and maybe that can be the way that we can make the case to bring it back, whether we call it something else, but the work still needs to be done. And just because we took those words out of higher education doesn't mean that we solved the problems, because we absolutely have not.
I thank you for both of you for, you have this expertise in this space that is so important, and every time I hear you speak, it just makes me admire the work you're doing so much. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about that is an overarching problem in the Utah Legislature, and it relates to this, is incredible overreach. And on so many levels. So we have a state board of higher education. We have 8 university presidents in our state, a number of technical college presidents. What in the world are we as a legislature telling them how to run their university? We have tasked these people who have been hired with complex interview process. We have a board that is supposed to be doing oversight, but we're not telling the chemistry department about, whether you're going to teach about carbolic acid or not. What in the world is happening where we have decided that this legislative body is going to need to get into people's, how these universities function. We're not talking about the engineering department. We're not talking, this is part of, as Stacy said, a national narrative, and Utah got trapped in the middle of it because of their own making of overreach. And whether it be productive choices, whether it be how the university, whether it be that about book banning, all of this stuff is overreach, and it's not respecting the freedom of the individual that made this part of this country great. We talk about freedom all of the time, and yet here we are trying to smash it at every opportunity. So I am, to your original question, I think we're going to need to get a little bit of balance back in the system and have people just say, what in the world is the legislature for? And get away from being a nanny state. Hi, everybody online.
So this question is for Stacy. Much of your work in the community has been centered around helping those with disabilities, yourself included, as you stated. And, you know, I'm a caregiver for adults with disabilities myself. I work at a day program as well as a group home, so I want to sincerely thank you for the work you've done there. Like you said, you started an annual event called Awesome Autistic Ogden to celebrate neurodiversity, and worked with the local police department to create a voluntary autism registry to make sure the interactions between the neurodiverse and the police are positive. If elected to the Utah Senate, how do you plan to build on this progress with people with disabilities, and what more could our state government do to support these communities?
Oh my gosh, so much, so much. And to that point, I think that is also what is going to help get me elected. Because when I talk to families about these issues and they have a disabled loved one, they can relate to that. They can relate to that fear, that frustration. So they can look past, oh yeah, she might be a Democrat, but she's doing the work that is going to help my family. So with the autism registry with Ogden Police Department, so there was actually another police department that I had seen that had implemented this, and so I think it was Clearfield was the one that I had first heard about, and then there was also one in Salt Lake. So because I had a relationship with Chief Family at the time, who was the chief of Ogden Police Department, I reached out and I said, how could we have this happen here in Ogden? Because what it does is families or self-advocates can opt in and put in their information with Weber County Dispatch. So if a call were to come in, and it doesn't have to be that it was a call about the person, but if there's a person with disabilities, neurodiversity, autism in the home, the law enforcement officer on the way will get that information. This information will pop up and they will be able to see, maybe I'm going out for a domestic violence call, but there's a child in the home who has autism. I can now be cognizant of that. So if I show up, bang, 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 scaring this child in the home, and I don't know that this child might come out looking defensive, might even be brandishing a weapon, like it could be a bad outcome for everyone. So we just wanted to I wanted to try to alleviate that. And also our law enforcement, they want to be prepared. They want to know what they're getting into. So this is a way to help them do better, and then to also keep our loved ones safe. I had just seen multiple stories coming out of, there was one a few years ago out of Salt Lake where a 13-year-old autistic boy ended up getting shot 11 times. 11 times. And officers knew that he was autistic and he was running away. So that ended up, I think they ended up settling on that case, but I don't want that. I don't want that for my family. I don't want that for other people's families. And so that is one of the things that I would like to implement statewide. I think that would be a great thing for all of our first responders to have access to that. And again, it's opt-in. I've had people ask me, does it violate HIPAA? Does it, this is families and individuals that can opt in. No one is ever going to force you, oh my God, you have a disability, we're forcing you to be, that is not going to happen. The other thing is that some of the research that came out of this Autism After 21 initiative is that our young adults, once they age out of public school, they fall off this cliff of resources that are available to them. And navigating the Division of Services for People with Disabilities, navigating trying to get disability social security, like all of these processes are so cumbersome and difficult. And we've navigated them with our son, and we have a good amount of privilege. We have vehicles. We speak English as a first language. We can take time off if we need to take them to appointments. What about the families who are falling through the cracks? What about our families who don't know how to navigate? We had to get our son re-diagnosed with autism to get on the wait list for DSPD because his diagnosis was more than 5 years old. I think that right there is a huge problem. We should not have, if someone gets a diagnosis at 9 and then we're trying to get them on a wait list, like, I don't think there should be an expiration. So again, it's just, I feel like we can make improvements to our processes, but even getting him on the wait list, he was 4,614 on that wait list. So the chances of him ever actually accessing anything, and again, we're at a place right now where we're good, we can take care of him, but what happens when we're not here? So we know we just have huge gaps, and I want to make things better for our families that have those same concerns. We have some, Park City is building an inclusive housing. I would love to see, I mean, we talk about the housing crisis as is, but that's not taking into account our elderly, our people with disabilities. So those are things that I want to be in the rooms when we're having the conversations. Like, yeah, we need to address housing in general, but also, So, sorry, kind of went on and on.
So this is a question for all three once again, but I think this might be particularly relevant for Representative Lesser. So as you stated, you are an OBGYN. I heard something at the canvassing event. Was it, I think someone said you delivered 6,000 babies? Is that something?
If we
like-
were counting.
Oh, and we were counting.
That's a lot.
Yeah, so since the overturning of Roe v. Wade via the Dobbs decision in 2022, Utah has tried to implement multiple bills aimed at restricting abortion that have gotten tied up in the courts. Notably, the trigger ban, which essentially is a complete abortion ban with very little exceptions. In no week of pregnancy would it be legal to get an abortion in the bill Utah Republicans passed. Now, since these measures have been stopped in the courts, the legislature is trying to intimidate them into doing their bidding, such as a rule that was passed which essentially empowers the state attorney general to demand judges give them more reasoning as to why they ruled the way they did to potentially reverse their decision. So the Republican legislature is so committed to ripping away a woman's fundamental right to make decisions about their own body that they're willing to destroy our system of checks and balances to get their way. There's also even more talk about Republicans going after the courts this next legislative session due to, as we've said, the Utah Supreme Court striking down the Republican-backed Amendment D as well as Amendment A ballot measures. So I was going to say if elected, but when elected, how will you guys fight back against this tyrannical government that is the legislature as well as the governor to safeguard reproductive rights as well as our American system of government? So yeah, let's start with Representative Lesser.
Oh boy, that's a really complicated and wonderful question. Well, first of all, every child who takes social studies learns about the importance of balance of power, the executive, legislative, and judicial branch. And when it gets out of whack, it really just results in terrible outcomes. And we've seen this through our country's history. I am relieved that our courts saw, that our district court enjoined the trigger ban. And people talk about states as the laboratories of democracy. And we are seeing in the laboratory of democracy that's called Idaho, what would happen in Utah if our trigger ban goes into effect. And I can tell you what's happening in Idaho is that doctors are leaving there in force, and OB/GYN services are being cut back. Women are being transported to Utah because our bill has been enjoined for appropriate medical care that any single one of us 100 times over would have done the right thing for the benefit of that mother. And yet we are seeing women on death's door and arriving into Utah hospitals because of what's happened in Idaho and if our bill comes into place. I hope our judiciary remains strong. There have been a number of attempts to try to alter the judiciary, and we are going to need every single member of the Utah Bar to talk about what this means for the future of our country. I think many of you have followed the case of Amendment D, where the Constitution of Utah was attempted to be changed because the legislature did not like the unanimous ruling of the Supreme Court. Now, what kind of nonsense is that? They changed the rules. And not only that, not only did they go against the Supreme Court unanimously ruling against them, but then they decided that they're going to make a bill because they also missed the deadline to get on the ballot. So we changed the law for that. This, you all are hearing a recurrent theme here of throwing away the standards of government for the benefit of a group of people who need to get back to what does government mean. I think we've got some rocky times ahead, but if we're successful in bringing about a blockade of the supermajority so that you cannot override a veto with the 2/3, if we can at least break the supermajority, that will be what it's going to take to have us defend the courts.
One other thing I was going to say is I was just reading, I think it's the New York Times, 3 women, they were highlighting that are proud Republican women in Arizona that had different stories about why they were standing up against these terrible laws. Number one is, and I'm sure Dr. Lesser can attest to this, many of them are not medically accurate. So there's people making laws about women's bodies that have no understanding of how a woman's body works. That's a problem. But also the complexity of this issue is coming to bear not only on women and people who give birth, but also their families, and understanding these outcomes that are so horrific that we've heard people losing their lives. But also the fact that even if a woman herself would not choose to eliminate a fetus, they don't feel appropriate to make that decision for other people, because there's all kinds of reasons why people might make those types of decisions or have that procedure. So I think that people are starting to understand the complexity of the issue, and that they don't feel that the government is the body that should be making these decisions, that people themselves should make, but also with a physician and their families.
Utah already does not do a great job for women. We have one of the worst gender wage gaps, I think, if not the worst gender wage gap. We have higher rates of domestic violence and sexual assault. And even when this bill was it 2022? I remember one of the female representatives in our legislature kind of made some viral TikTok and other, she made some fame by saying, I do trust women with their bodies. I trust them, or with their choice or their bodies, I trust them to control their intake of semen. I don't trust people who think like that to be making decisions for us. I was a birth mom as a teenager, as a junior in high school. I got pregnant, and my choice was to place my baby for adoption. And it was an extremely painful choice. And I do not believe that our elected leaders need to be making those choices. So, this is an issue about the outcomes for women in the state of Utah, and while it is a very complex issue, The people who currently are making the policy, it's not it. 75% men, it's not it.
I'll pass the mic back to Alex to ask a few more questions.
I apologize, I'm gonna have to leave in like 5 minutes, and I'm really sorry about that. I just have a family obligation.
So, given the relatively recent passage of the bill that banned gender-affirming care for minors in the state, as well as sports bans for trans women, we just wanted to hear your thoughts and position on trans rights and bills in this county.
Well, here we go again. Recurring theme, overreach. Many of you, well, when I was in the legislature in the throes of the pandemic for the vaccine was just being rolled out, I heard this refrain, my body, my choice. And parents should be able to make choices for their children in education, what books they read, whether they get a vaccine or not. And I thought it was a logical conclusion that they should also respect the rights of parents and children to make medical decisions with medical professionals. And so I voted against that bill. And similarly, I think that High School Sports Association has had a perfectly reasonable process for trans girls to be able to participate. It worked just fine. And once again, we fell into the messaging that is part of the national agenda to induce fear and loathing. We cannot let hatred win, and that's the reason all of us are fighting so hard to be in the legislature, because this overreach is ridiculous and it's hurting people. And certainly all of us stand with our LGBTQ brothers and sisters and in opposition to this.
And non-binary.
And not
But I would just say I totally agree with everything you're saying, but I also just want to admit, just like the DEI passage, this does harm just having the conversation. My husband works here on campus, and even when the legislature started talking about this bathroom bill, a student comes in the office crying, am I allowed to go to the bathroom? They don't know how this impacts them. Even when we start having conversations where laws haven't happened yet, this causes people trauma and causes them to be, the victim, and because they're the most vulnerable and the easiest to pick on, it almost seems, right? It's like, this seems like it's open territory for bullying other people, and it does terrible harm. We already know that trans folks, especially trans folks of color, are, they die at such a huge rate. There's violence against them. They have to fear for their lives just to exist. And in my mind, that's unacceptable in any way, but you certainly would want to follow the guidance of the AMA or the pediatrics associations around these issues. And our legislatures don't have that expertise.
Transgender people in the state of Utah make up less than 1%. I think it's about 0.6, 0.7% of our population. And to see this last session, it was especially with the anti-DEI bill and the bathroom bill that were pushed through, they were top priority. They were like, no matter what else we pass, there's clean air, who cares? Great Salt Lake, we'll get to it. We don't want the men in the bathrooms. They were creating a solution for a problem that did not exist. And as a school board member, and the conversations that we had as a board about how we were going to implement this policy angered me to think of the students that it was impacting. Because now saying, if a student was born a girl, that student needs to use the girls' restroom. We don't want men, we don't want boys and girls, but they are forcing, by their own, the way the bill is written, they're forcing a girl to go in a boy's bathroom and a boy to go in a girl's bathroom. And I know transgender students in our district. And I know that they present, and that if they were to go into the restroom that matched their biological sex at birth, that would be a huge problem. So they, by this bill, actually are creating a bigger problem and bullying some of our most marginalized students and people who live in this state. And I think there's this, the fact that, you know, Dr. Lesser right now is dealing with someone who is smearing her because the way she voted on this bill. I think it is such an unkindness to our LGBTQ and specifically our transgender loved ones, because to have an elected body take aim, it does feel like just pure bullying. And so whoever watches this and hears us, I want you to know that you belong and that we will advocate and fight for you.
How you talked about your son having to be re-diagnosed, I sort of dealt with a similar issue actually on my campus through our Disability Resource Center. And I have ADHD and I was looking to possibly get accommodations. I'm actually an out-of-state student, so I'm from Iowa, and I was diagnosed with ADHD in Iowa, and they said that I would have to be diagnosed here, most likely through CAPS, which is our Counseling and Psychological Services on our campus. And there's a huge wait list, and also for proper ADHD diagnosis, there's a cost associated with that, which is a struggle for many college students, including myself. So what do you think the legislature could do? You know, like when you are elected, like how would you address some of those issues that we see on college campuses?
Yeah, like I think becoming aware of issues like that, because I think that's absolutely unnecessary red tape. Getting a diagnosis in one state and then not being able to, that is still who you are and a part of who you are. So that's absolutely wild to me that that would be policy. So, and again, that might not be something, that might be something as a university that maybe it's a policy that the university needs to address. And so I would just say, maybe like finding out where that responsibility lies, but I mean, if it's something that as a legislature that I could address, that's absolutely something. Those are the kinds of things that I want to help to improve access and yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Any other questions from here? So I think just maybe two more questions would be good. So this question could be for both of you. So in 2017, as president, Donald Trump significantly reduced the size of two national monuments in southern Utah, Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante. Trump cut Bears Ears from roughly 1.3 million acres to roughly 228,000, only about 15% of its original size. Grand Staircase was reduced by roughly half from its nearly 1.9 million acres to about 1 million. In 2021, Joe Biden reversed Trump's actions, restoring the monuments due to the importance of protecting these areas for cultural heritage, environmental conservation, and biodiversity. Biden's decision was celebrated by environmental groups and indigenous communities. It's important to know it's Indigenous Peoples Day. But this decision was criticized by Republicans and certain business interests. Republicans like Utah House Speaker Mike Schultz argue that large amounts of federally protected land limit economic opportunities. And one might assume that if Utah Republicans get control of the land, they might use it for things like oil extraction or real estate. This is especially concerning because many of the Republicans in the legislature made their money from real estate, and there would of course be many wealthy people lining up to buy a mansion in these beautiful habitats. So Rosemary, given your experience in the Utah House, and as well as Stacy, what are your guys' opinion on whether these lands should be protected federally or whether they should be handed over to the Utah state government? And additionally, because this kind of goes in with, I think there would be an interest to make real estate on these lands, maybe an argument would be, well, we could have more affordable housing. You know, what do you think Utah can do to mediate that issue as well without, you know, destroying your natural environment?
Well, First off, Utah has been complaining about about public land control essentially since the beginning. Although I think at the beginning they were busy settling the Wasatch Front. But as time has gone on, there has been greater push to go against our state's admittance to the United States, which was that those federal lands were designated as part of Utah's admittance to the Union. Now, speaking of money, one of my colleagues in the legislature, I don't know how he happened to do this, commissioned a study on the economics of public land use. Now, mind you, the federal government is paying the state of Utah. There is this payment in lieu of taxes. So the federal government is actually already reimbursing Utah. That money would go away if Utah took that land back and used it willy-nilly, which they do not have the authority to do. Now, there's been a lot of anguish about when the Bureau of Land Management closes a certain road to work on and how that impacts recreation. I mean, road updates are a way of life, not only in rural areas, but certainly in our area. I mean, how many times have you had to make a U-turn in Ogden when the street's being closed? And they're upset about land trying to rehabilitate roads. So, long answer, A, I'm big on public lands. B, when you look at the economic impact of those public lands, it brings in more money to Utah than any other serviceable way it could be used. Now, we have plenty of land opportunities to be able to develop without having to take these precious national treasures. And so I would say to my colleagues, and by the way, when you think about it, speaking of Indigenous Peoples Days, there are people on reservations in Utah that don't even still have running water. And, thinking that these public lands are now going to be able to be the next St. George is a pipe dream. To put that infrastructure in place is incredibly expensive. Right now, we are seeing an amazing burgeoning of the economic influence of recreation in our state. People come to the Big Five and bring over $2 billion to the state in revenue. Why would we want to give up our golden goose?
I don't even know what I can add to that.
We certainly don't want to cook the goose.
Except to say, I think when we're already concerned about our resources and our Great Salt Lake and I don't think we need to do more that is going to basically I believe it's to fatten up the wallets of those who are going to benefit from building and developing. So I would say anything that we can do we need to be protecting our lands. We need to be bringing in our Indigenous community to these decision-making processes because we are on Indigenous land. We already kind of came. This is the whole history of our state, and so I think just protecting our resources, and certainly we do have a lot of legislators who are. They would benefit from developing, so. And all of the smart stuff that Rosemary said.
So, just kind of to piggyback off of that, how do we safeguard our environment more broadly? From the Great Salt Lake drying up to our air quality, which is among the worst in the country. I think even once you get up there, amongst the worst in the world even. So, yeah.
These are the types of really pressing issues that our legislature needs to be confronting head on, instead of diverting their attention in the shortest legislative length of just about any legislative body in the country. So in our precious 45 days, we need to be focusing on this. And the water issue is something that will forever be part of Utah's concerns. Even if we did not have the Great Salt Lake, we're one of the most arid states in the country. And as our temperatures rise, we are going to need to be even more vigilant on that. So what it begins with is that we don't divert water from the Bear River. If water, I support our farmers. We talked about the importance of farming, but one of the things the legislature has done that I fully believe in is we have incentivized farmers to use less water by helping them pay for efficient water use, because as all of us likely know, about 75% of the water that we do use is for agriculture. And so if we can be wiser in that, that will be an important thing. As far as air quality, now that's not the end of water, but we could do a symposium on water until the sun rose tomorrow. But with regard to air quality, we have to be incredibly vigilant on that. And part of it, especially with the Olympics coming in 10 years, we have got to make our public transportation first rate. It is unacceptable that we have this lovely little train, nicely named, the Frontrunner, and it goes, once an hour on the weekends and doesn't run on Sunday. Now, what kind of nonsense is that? So we need to be really robust in our, because we also know that our air quality is dependent on emissions. And when you look at places like Houston, Texas, where they keep building roads and roads and more roads and more roads, they get more and more and more congested. The Katy Highway is 28 lanes wide. And what happens to our air quality? Also, another thing that I wanted to bring your attention, and this is where the citizens make a difference, is last year there was a developer for gravel pits who had bought up land right at the entrance to Parley's Canyon and wanted to essentially dig that out, which would be putting all this dust into the air. What's the last thing we need? And if we're going to be hosting the Olympics, can you imagine what it would be like that the entrance to this beautiful canyon that we're taking the world to has, essentially been defaced by digging into it? So we activated people, and this was beautiful. Thousands of people flooded not only the legislature, but they wrote to representatives and killed that bill. And so, there's so many times you hear Democrats, we do get a little doom and gloom from time to time. But there are ways that we activate people and say, what are you doing? You've got to speak up. And when it came to air quality and putting all of that dust into the air, we won. And so that's great. And also for air quality, filling the Great Salt Lake with water is going to be wonderful for our air quality too. So public transportation, conserving our water, and keeping people from doing stupid things.
I just want to add a couple points, is that we have disparities with east side and west side. So anything that might be, if our air quality is bad on one side, it's going to be worse on the other. The railroad runs along and creates that division, and so our families who live on the west side, they are the ones who are exposed to more of the toxins and the elements. And so when we're having conversations, we've got to make sure that we're looking at our communities that are being disproportionately impacted. Second, and this is not necessarily around kind of the environmental issues, but we know that we are on a major fault line, and that it's not if, but when we will have a big one. And in this last session, there was a committee that was looking at, what we need to do to prepare for the next big earthquake. And they sunset that committee. They sunset that committee this year because they were finding, like, we know that we would need to have our buildings come up to code. We would have to do X, Y, Z. Our schools would have to do this, our hospitals would have to do this. So they were finding all of these problems that we're gonna have to throw money at to fix in order to prepare for the next big earthquake. So instead they said, we're just gonna stop looking at the problem. We're just gonna boop, boop, get rid of that committee. And I think that is terrifying that our electeds are not following through to make sure that we're doing what we need to do to prepare for that. And when it does happen, it is going to, if kids are in school, it's going to be bad. Anyone who's in a building where there's going to be a lot of people, it's going to be catastrophic.
So this is kind of the last question, and then we'll kind of end this off. Get this to scroll up, okay. So, in 2022, there's this case that not a lot of people know about, but I kind of want to bring it to you guys' attention. So, in 2022, animal rights activists were charged with theft and burglary for rescuing two piglets who are named Lily and Lizzie from a Smithfield Foods factory farm in southern Utah. And, they took video evidence of what they found inside this factory farm, and it was just disgusting. There were some piglets literally drowning in their mother's feces. The mother pigs had their nipples shredded. They were trapped in cages so small they couldn't even turn around. And then when they took two piglets out of this area, the veterinarian they took them to found that if the activists wouldn't have stepped in, they would have died. And during the trial, the video evidence the activists took inside the factory farm was ruled inadmissible to prevent the jury from feeling sympathy for the activists' cause. This didn't work though, as when the jury was done deliberating, they returned a unanimous verdict that found the activists not guilty for saving these suffering animals. In response to this, the Utah State Legislature passed a bill which clarified the theft code to entail that even if someone's property was damaged, that does not make it justified to steal said property. Of course, I don't think anyone would disagree with this, except that many don't think that other sentient beings should be reduced to mere property and that they ought to be treated with dignity and respect. If elected back into the legislature, in case of Stacy, if you're elected to the legislature, how do you guys plan to fight against this notion that humans are just kind of entitled to torture and kill animals, and will you oppose bills like this that arise out of circumstances? Especially, it kind of goes on with judicial independence as well with this one.
That was a first for me, and I had a lot of questions on a lot of different topics. That's a first for me. I had not heard of that case and that situation, and in my mind, that feels like animal cruelty at the very least, and probably like a whole bunch of other laws that are being broken in my mind, as far as even properly. I don't know. There's legal jargon for it, but taking care of your what's the word I'm looking for? Humane treatment of your animals, even though you're gonna slaughter them and sell them, but.
I think it's important to know a lot of the animal cruelty laws, they only apply to like cats and dogs. When it gets into agriculture, the protections for farmed animals, it's scarce to none. So that's probably why I wanted to ask this question. I think it's very under-talked about issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is, and what I think needs to happen in this, though, and we have seen the consequences of poor management of food production with the listeria outbreak at Boar's Head, is that our state should have a responsibility, yes, to the animals, But also, I mean, I was complaining about overreach for most of this conversation, but this is a place where actually there should be the ability for state agencies to monitor this. We license we license hospitals and we license facilities where you work. These factory farms should also have at least a regulatory component for the benefit of the health of the consumers too. Now, I mean, quite honestly, I agree with you 100% as far as the cruelty to the animals. And I also, though, recognize that to get other people to buy in, we have to show them that this is a danger to themselves as well. And so that type of treatment to other animals in those farms is going to have deleterious effects on the food chain. And they have a responsibility to the citizens of this state to protect the food chain. So I think that that's the strategy we go at, even though we may care very much about those animals. The reality is if we have people recognize that it's going to hurt them, then hopefully we will come to our senses.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, this is just kind of a question to, I guess, lead it off on, and then if any audience members have any more questions. So obviously, it's no surprise to anyone that Utah is a very conservative state. What advice would you guys give to anyone thinking of running as a Democrat in Utah, and what would you say to anyone who thinks doing so would be futile due to how conservative our state is historically?
Well, I would say that the times they are changing. And thank you. They are changing. And they're changing on so many levels that I think that the demographics are going to shift in our favor. Now, will that necessarily result in more people being Democrats as electeds? Maybe yes and maybe no. Right now, there are a number of people in the state running as independents, and for the most part, they are Democrats. But they're in really red areas where voting for a Democrat is not a foregone conclusion. Many of them, including a good friend of mine up in Logan, great guy, Patrick Belmont, who's running, he ran as a Democrat and came really close, and people said to him, I just can't vote for you because you're a Democrat. So he's running as an independent, and he'll caucus with the Democrats. So sometimes you have to be pragmatic and say in some of these areas, but I think the demographic shift over time, and Stacy will probably be here to see it beyond my time, but the times are changing. There were 4 precincts in Provo that went for Joe Biden in 2020. I mean, who would have ever thought that would have happened? So with independent redistricting, with younger people having little patience for this nonsense, like unfair treatment of minorities, of all. I mean, our younger people have no patience for that. We as the older generation needs to embrace their wisdom, and I'm not giving up.
When I was thinking about running, I first met with my other school board members, because there's 7 of us, and our superintendent. Because at that point, I was just a year into my 4-year term, and all of a sudden I'm like, hey, I might run for the state senate. And I thought they would immediately be like, no, that's stupid, you shouldn't do that. And they said, well, who would you be running against? And I told them my opponent's name, and they said, you need to run against him. You need to run against him, and you need to win. Especially because he chairs the Senate Education Committee, and as school board members, he is very bad for education. So the word started getting out very quickly that I was thinking about running, and the former superintendent from Weber School District called me up and he said, that's so great that you're running. Could you run as a Republican? And I said, no, I don't think anyone would fall for that. And I don't think that I could act well enough. And he said, what about running as an independent? And I was like, well, I mean, maybe, but I'm a Democrat. So then from there, someone else reached out to me. It was actually someone who had worked very heavily in Evan McMullen's campaign. And so he called me and said, I hear you're thinking of running. Can I talk to you about running as an independent? And we went and I had this conversation. He showed me all the numbers. He showed me all of the ways that Democrats will never win, but independents can. And if we can, this is how we break up the supermajority. And I thought about it, and I just, I had to choose what felt right and authentic to me. And I said I would rather run and lose as a Democrat than win as an independent. Because, and honestly, even if I ran as an independent, people would, I feel like they would know, you're a Democrat. And I'm very happy that I made this decision. It is certainly an uphill battle. And also the fact that we are women, we have an uphill battle of being a woman of color as an extra layer of challenge. But with my school board race, I was told the same thing, that I would win, that, I was a first-time candidate, I was running against a two-term incumbent, the odds are not in my favor. And so for me to come away from that race with nearly 65% of the vote, nobody was expecting that. I was hoping for 70%. So I think that being authentic and being brave, because it is a scary place to be in, especially right now with the dynamics of our presidential election, but also knowing that Utah really isn't, we're just not as red as everyone thinks we are. There's a great professor out of BYU who's been doing a lot of research into this, and I didn't even know this guy. He reached out to me on Instagram and he said, your race is winnable, I'm gonna help you win, and I'm like, this guy's way smarter than me, and if he says it's so, it's so. And I think, if anyone in this room, anyone watching, if they ever wanted to run, and certainly in the future, our demographics are changing. And I want to leave you with that hope that, and it's possible, and I'm super excited for Angela and for me and for Rosemary, and to make Weber County purple, and to get her to be, as much as I'm sure she loves being the only blue dot outside of Salt Lake, we will be happily bouncing around next to her as fellow blue dots.
And there are, the last closing comments that I want to make is just that our legislature is a citizen legislature. No one has complete subject matter expertise on all of these things that we've talked about. And I remember the very first time I got up to do a speech on the floor, and I was so nervous, and I'm thinking to myself, Rosemary, what are you getting nervous about? You've operated on thousands of people and all of this, what's with you? And then all of a sudden, it came to me, I thought, wait a minute. This is a citizen legislature, and I am a citizen. And so are you. And so I know you can do it. There are programs for encouraging people to get the skills that it takes to run a campaign. But more than anything, it is an honor for all of us to serve and represent the people of this state and do it with thoughtfulness and integrity and science-based reasoning. So, thank you.
Well, let's go because it's bad enough candidate to drag down all the Republican candidates, so all of you guys can win. But yeah. So, if there's any audience questions, if not, then that should do it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you guys so much for being here. Angela as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's great.
Yep.